The Saturday morning market in Tulare County was packed when Elena Reyes arrived with 43 quail eggs arranged in recycled egg cartons, each one small and speckled like river stones. She'd borrowed a folding table, paid $12 for the vendor spot, and had exactly $9 left to her name. By noon, she'd sold every single egg at $8 per dozen, and the line of customers waiting at her empty table wouldn't leave. 7 weeks earlier, the agricultural loan officer at Tulare County Credit Union folded his hands on September 6, 2023, at 2:17 p.m. and delivered the verdict Elena had been expecting. Miss Reyes, with your income history and the property's lack of established infrastructure, we can't approve financing for a conventional poultry operation. I'm sorry. Elena Reyes, 26 years old, sat across from him holding a business plan she'd spent 3 weeks writing. She'd inherited 12 acres in Pixley from her grandfather 2 months earlier, flat land, decent soil, a collapsed barn, and a small house that needed everything. Property 142-088-029. Free and clear, no mortgage, which should have felt like a blessing. But land without capital was just dirt. What if I started smaller? She asked. Chickens instead of the turkey operation I proposed. The loan officer, whose nameplate read Stephen Marsh, looked uncomfortable. Miss Reyes, even a small chicken operation requires significant startup capital. Housing, feed infrastructure, regulatory compliance, processing relationships. You're looking at minimum $20,000 to do it right. Your grandfather's property has been vacant for 4 years. There's no water system, no power to the outbuildings. No, I understand, Elena said quietly. She stood, took her business plan, and left. She sat in her truck in the parking lot, a 1995 Ford Ranger her grandfather had taught her to drive when she was 15, before the cancer took him the first time. He'd beaten it once, worked 3 more years, then it came back faster and meaner. He'd spent his last 6 months in the small house in Pixley, and Elena had driven down every weekend from her job at a Fresno restaurant to sit with him. The last time she'd seen him conscious, he'd pressed something into her hand, a key on a faded red string. Barrage, he'd whispered. Workbench. Left side. Everything you need to know. She'd found the metal box 3 days after his funeral. Inside, his notebooks from 40 years of farming, vegetables mostly, some cattle, always small scale, and one thin journal dedicated entirely to quail. Her grandfather had raised Coturnix quail for 2 years in the late 1980s, selling eggs and meat to Asian markets in Fresno and Bakersfield. The notes were meticulous. Costs per bird, feed conversion ratios, egg production rates, customer lists with phone numbers that were probably decades out of date. The final entry, dated March 1991, had to sell the flock. Tomatoes are more profitable, and the restaurant doesn't have time for both. But quail are remarkable birds. Low space, low feed, high production. If someone wanted to start small and grow careful, this is the way. 100 birds can pay for 200 birds can pay for 400. Build slow. The market is still there, just scattered. Elena had read that journal 5 times. Then she'd done 3 weeks of research, current regulations, hatchery sources, feed costs, market demand. Quail eggs were selling for $6 to $10 per dozen at farmers markets and specialty stores, more than chickens, and the birds produced eggs year-round in California's climate. The startup cost for 100 birds, if she did everything herself, approximately $1,900. She had $20 to $100. Her entire savings after paying her grandfather's final medical bills and the property tax that had been 2 years overdue. $300 to live on while building the operation was insane. The smart move was to find work, save money, build slowly. But she'd looked at her grandfather's notes again that night, sitting in the small house that smelled like dust and old medicine. One line, written in the margin of a cost breakdown. Sometimes you have to trust the birds before the banks trust you. On September 18th, she drove to a hatchery outside Modesto and bought 100-day-old Coturnix quail chicks for $400. The hatchery owner, a Vietnamese woman named Mrs. Nguyen, looked at Elena's truck, her worn clothes, and her careful questions. You know what you're doing? Mrs. Nguyen asked. My grandfather raised these in the 80s. I have his notes. Mrs. Nguyen's expression softened slightly. First time, yes ma'am. You need to keep them at 95 degrees the first week, drop 5 degrees every week after. They're fragile when young. You have a brooder set up? Elena had built one in the garage from scrap lumber and heat lamps, following her grandfather's sketches exactly. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. and Gwen packed the chicks carefully into a ventilated box. Your grandfather was smart to try quail. They're good birds. Honest birds. You feed them. They feed you. Good luck. Elena drove home with 100 peeping chicks and $297 in her bank account. The neighbors came to watch like she was performing a slow-motion car accident. The Martinez family owned a large vegetable operation to the east, 200 acres of tomatoes, peppers, and squash. Rosa Martinez, maybe 60 years old, arrived on September 22nd while Elena was carrying 50-pound feed sacks from the truck to the garage. You're Elena? Raphael's granddaughter. Yes, ma'am. Elena set the sack down, breathing hard. Her shoulders were already screaming. Rosa looked at the garage, where the sound of peeping came through the walls. What are you raising in there? Quail. Rosa's eyebrows went up. Quail? Not chickens. No, ma'am. Quail. To eat or for eggs? Both, eventually. Eggs first. Rosa called something in Spanish over her shoulder. Her husband appeared. Jorge, a solid man with gray in his beard. They had a brief conversation Elena couldn't quite follow. Jorge walked closer, listening to the peeping. How many? He asked. 100. He whistled low. That's ambitious for a first time. You know how to keep them. My grandfather's notes. He raised them in the 80s. Jorge nodded slowly. Raphael was a good farmer. Smart. But quail. He shook his head. Nobody around here raises quail anymore. There's no market. You'll have eggs nobody wants. There are Asian markets in Fresno, Elena said. Specialty stores. Farmers markets. That's an hour away. Gas costs money. I know. Rosa touched Jorge's arm gently. To Elena, she said, if you need anything, advice, help, you ask. Your grandfather was good to us when we first started. We remember. After they left, Elena went back to the garage. The chicks were 2 days old, tiny bodies huddled under the heat lamps. She'd lost 3 already. Normal, according to her grandfather's notes, but each death felt like failure. She checked the temperature, added water to the dispensers, scattered starter feed. The work was constant. Temperature checks every 4 hours. Water changes twice daily. Feed monitoring. Cleaning droppings from the brooder bedding. She set alarms through the night, slept in 3-hour blocks. By October 1st, she was down to 94 birds and $212. The feed store owner in Pixley, a man named Dennis, maybe 70, watched her load 50-pound sacks of game bird starter into the truck bed. You're the one bought Raphael's old place. Yes, sir. Heard you're trying to raise quail. His tone wasn't quite mocking, but close. That's a rich person's hobby. People who raise quail do it for fun, not money. Elena pulled the sack into position, caught her breath. My grandfather made money with them. That was 40 years ago. Market's different now. You'd be better off getting a regular job, maybe leasing the land to someone who knows what they're doing. She paid in cash, counted out exact change, and left without responding. The birds grew faster than she'd expected. By October 15th, they were fully feathered, moved into the permanent housing she'd built in the collapsed barn. Hutches made from salvaged lumber and wire mesh, each one designed to her grandfather's specifications. Slanted floors for egg collection, droppings falling through to catchment trays, ventilation and shade. At 6 weeks old, the female started laying. Elena collected the first eggs on October 23rd, small, speckled, perfect. 14 eggs the first day, 31 the second day, 62 the third. She called the phone numbers in her grandfather's journal. Most were disconnected. 2 answered but said they didn't buy quail eggs anymore. 1, a small Asian grocery in Fresno, said maybe, bring samples. She drove to Fresno with 2 dozen eggs, used gas money she couldn't afford. The store owner, an elderly Chinese man, cracked 1 egg into a bowl, examined it, tasted it raw with soy sauce in a way that made Elena's stomach flip. Fresh, he said. Good color. How much? $4 a dozen. He laughed. I pay $2.50 for chicken eggs. These are smaller. $2. They're richer. More protein. Traditional Chinese medicine uses them. $2.50. Elena needed the sale desperately. She also knew her grandfather's notes said never to undervalue the product. $3. And I'll deliver weekly. He considered. 3 dozen a week, $3 per dozen. You miss a delivery, we're done. Deal. $9 a week wouldn't save her. She had 94 birds laying now, producing maybe 40 dozen eggs weekly. She needed more buyers. She spent the next week driving to every specialty grocery, health food store, and restaurant within 50 miles. Most wouldn't even let her in the door. 2 bought a dozen each to try. 1, a farm-to-table restaurant in Visalia, bought 5 dozen on the spot at $5 per dozen and asked if she could supply regularly. By November 1st, she had 4 steady buyers and a waiting list at the farmer's market in Tulare. The market manager, a woman named Patricia, had been skeptical. "People don't know what to do with quail eggs," Patricia said. "I'll bring recipe cards. Instructions for peeling. They're easier than people think. The vendor fee is $12. If you don't sell, you don't get it back." Elena had exactly $23. Spending $12 on a gamble was insane. "I'll take the spot," she said. The Saturday market setup started at 6 a.m. Elena arrived at 5:47 with her borrowed table, 43 dozen quail eggs in recycled cartons, and a handwritten sign. Fresh quail each GS. $8 per dozen. Recipes included. The vendor next to her, a woman selling organic vegetables, glanced at Elena's setup and smiled sympathetically. "First time?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good luck, honey. Quail eggs are a tough sell. Too exotic for most folks around here." The market opened at 8. Elena's first customer came at 8:42, a middle-aged Asian woman who stopped, stared, and immediately bought 3 dozen. "I haven't seen fresh quail eggs in years. Where have you been?" "Just started," Elena said, making change from her small cash box. "I'm here every Saturday. I'll tell my friends." By 9:30, Elena had sold 11 dozen. Word was spreading. She could see people pointing at her table from across the market. A restaurant chef came and bought 7 dozen, left his card, said he'd call about regular orders. 2 mothers with small children stopped, fascinated by the tiny speckled eggs, bought a dozen each just to try. By 11:15, she was sold out except for 1 dozen she'd held back for her standing orders. By noon, she had a line of disappointed customers and a waiting list of 17 people who'd left their phone numbers. Patricia, the market manager, stopped by? Well, I guess I was wrong. Elena was counting money in the cash box, her hands shaking slightly. $276. More than she'd made in a week at the restaurant in Fresno. From one morning's work. "Can I get a permanent spot?" Elena asked. "You're on the list for next Saturday." That week, Elena got 7 calls from her market waiting list. 3 restaurants contacted her. The Asian grocery in Fresno doubled their order. She spent every afternoon gathering eggs, washing them gently, packing them in cartons she'd bought in bulk. She also drove back to Mrs. Nguyen's hatchery and bought 200 more chicks. Mrs. Nguyen raised an eyebrow. "Good first month. Better than expected. Told you. Honest birds." Mrs. Nguyen carried the chicks out personally. "You're going to need a bigger setup soon." "I know." By December, Elena had 294 laying birds and more orders than she could fill. She'd hired 2 part-time workers, high school students from Pixley who needed after-school jobs, paid them cash, taught them how to collect eggs without stress to the birds. She'd installed proper electrical to the barn, built another 20 hutches, and bought a used truck canopy to keep eggs temperature-controlled during deliveries. The money wasn't huge, maybe $2,000 a week in sales, but her costs were manageable. Feed, supplies, labor, vehicle expenses. She was clearing $1,000 a week profit, sometimes more, and the neighbors noticed. Jorge Martinez came by in mid-December. "Elena, I need to ask you something. My nephew wants to start farming, but he doesn't have money for land. Could you teach him what you're doing?" "The quail operation." Elena was in the barn, checking waters. "He'd be competing with me. Different market. He wants to sell in Bakersfield area. Different customers." She thought about her grandfather's notes, the knowledge that had almost been lost. "Tell him to come by Saturday morning. I'll show him the setup." By January, she was consulting for 3 new quail farmers, people who'd heard about her success, wanted to start small operations. She charged $200 per consultation. Some she helped for free because they reminded her of herself 3 months earlier, broke, desperate, and stubborn. Dennis from the feed store started keeping game bird feed in stock regularly. "You've created a mini industry," he said, not quite apologizing for his earlier skepticism, but close. "Got 4 people now raising quail around here. They all learned from you." The loan officer, Stephen Marsh, sent her an email in February. Miss Reyes, I saw your business featured in the AG Times. If you're interested in expansion financing, I'd like to revisit your application. We made a mistake." Elena read the email twice, then deleted it. She didn't need his money anymore. By March, 7 months after buying those first 100 chicks with her last savings, Elena had 450 laying birds, 12 regular wholesale accounts, 3 farmers market locations, and a waiting list for consulting services. She'd renovated the small house, installed a commercial egg washing station, and hired 3 full-time employees. She stood in the barn one evening after everyone had gone home, listening to the quiet sounds of contented birds, the soft coos and shuffling, the occasional flutter of wings. The collapsed barn was now solid, organized, humming with productive life. Her grandfather's journal sat on the workbench, worn and stained with work. She opened it to the last page she'd read 7 months earlier. "Sometimes you have to trust the birds before the banks trust you." Below it, in fresh ink, she added her own entry. Grandpa was right. Started with 100 birds and $2,200. 7 months later, 450 birds, $8,000 per week in sales, 3 full-time employees, 12 wholesale accounts. "The banks didn't believe in me. You did. The birds did. That was enough. The old knowledge still works. Small scale isn't failure, it's foundation. Build slow. Trust the work." The market was there, just scattered, waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it. "Thank you for leaving me more than land. You left me a path." She closed the journal carefully, wrapped it in its cloth, and walked outside. The evening air was cool and smelled like grass and distant orange blossoms. In the barn behind her, 450 quail settled in for the night. Healthy, productive, turning feed into eggs, into income, into future. Elena smiled and went inside to plan next month's expansion. The banks could keep their loans. She was building something better, a business that started with wisdom, grew with patience, and succeeded because her grandfather had trusted her enough to leave her not just property, but knowledge, and she trusted him enough to use it.